Chapter 10, Part 1 of The Mystery of 31 New Inn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mystery of 31 New Inn by R. Aston Freeman. Chapter 10. The Hunter Hunted. Part 1. The omnibus of those days was a leisurely vehicle. Its ordinary pace was a rather sluggish trot, and in a thickly populated thoroughfare its speed was further reduced by frequent stoppages. Bearing these facts in mind, I gave an occasional backward glance as we jogged northward, though my attention soon began to wander from the rather remote possibility of pursuit to the incidents of our late exploration. It had not been difficult to see that Thorndyke was very well pleased with the results of our search, but excepting the letter, which undoubtedly opened up a channel for further inquiry and possible identification, I could not perceive that any of the traces we had found justified his satisfaction. There were the spectacles, for instance. They were almost certainly the pair worn by Mr. Graves. But what then? It was exceedingly improbable that we should be able to discover the maker of them, and if we were, it was still more improbable that he would be able to give us any information that would help us. Spectacle makers are not usually on confidential terms with their customers. As to the other objects, I could make nothing of them. The little sticks of reed evidently had some use that was known to Thorndyke, and furnished by inference some kind of information about Weiss, Graves, or Mrs. Schallibaum. But I have never seen anything like them before, and they conveyed nothing whatever to me. Then the bottle that had seemed so significant to Thorndyke was to me quite uninforming. It did, indeed, suggest that some member of the household might be connected with the stage, but it gave no hint as to which one. Certainly that person was not Mr. Weiss, whose appearance was as remote from that of an actor as could well be imagined. At any rate, the bottle and its label gave me no more useful hint than it might be worth while to call on Mr. Fox and make inquiries, and something told me very emphatically that this was not what it had conveyed to Thorndyke. These reflections occupied me until the omnibus, having rumbled over London Bridge and up King William Street, joined the converging streams of traffic at the Mansion House. Here I got down and changed to an omnibus bound for Kensington, on which I travelled westward, pleasantly enough, looking down into the teeming streets and whiling away the time by meditating upon the very agreeable afternoon that I promised myself, and considering how far my new arrangement with Thorndyke would justify me in entering into certain domestic engagements of a highly interesting kind. What might have happened under other circumstances it is impossible to tell and useless to speculate. The fact is that my journey ended in a disappointment. I arrived, all agog, at the familiar house in Ensley Gardens, only to be told by a sympathetic housemaid that the family was out, that Mrs. Hornby had gone into the country and would not be home until night, and, which mattered a good deal more to me, that her niece, Miss Juliet Gibson, had accompanied her. Now a man who drops into lunch without announcing his intention or previously ascertaining those of his friends has no right to quarrel with fate if he finds an empty house. This philosophically I reflected as I turned away from the house in profound discontent, demanding of the universe in general why Mrs. Hornby need have perversely chosen my first free day to go gadding into the country, and above all, why she must needs spirit away the fair Juliet. This was the crowning misfortune, for I could have endured the absence of the elder lady with commendable fortitude, and since I could not immediately return to the temple, it left me a mere waif and stray for the time being. Instinct, of the kind that manifests itself especially about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, impelled me in the direction of Brompton Road, and finally landed me at a table in a large restaurant, apparently adjusted to the needs of ladies who had come from a distance to engage in the feminine sport of shopping. Here, while waiting for my lunch, I sat idly scanning the morning paper and wondering what I should do with the rest of the day, and presently it chanced that my eye caught the announcement of a matinee at the theatre in Sloane Square. It was quite a long time since I had been at the theatre, and, as the play, light comedy, seemed likely to satisfy my not very critical taste, I decided to devote the afternoon to reviving my acquaintance with the drama. Accordingly, as soon as my lunch was finished, I walked down the Brompton Road, stepped on to an omnibus, and was duly deposited at the door of the theatre. A couple of minutes later I found myself occupying an excellent seat in the second row of the pit, oblivious alike of my recent disappointment and of Thorndyke's words of warning. I am not an enthusiastic playgoer. To dramatic performances I am disposed to assign nothing further than the modest function of furnishing entertainment. I do not go to a theatre to be instructed or to have my moral outlook elevated. But by way of compensation I am not difficult to please. To a simple play, adjusted to my primitive taste, I can bring a certain bucolic appreciation that enables me to extract from the performance the maximum of enjoyment. And when, on this occasion, the final curtain fell and the audience rose, I rescued my hat from its insecure resting place, and turned to go with the feeling that I had spent a highly agreeable afternoon. Emerging from the theatre, borne on the outgoing stream, I presently found myself opposite the door to a tea shop. Instinct, the 5 o'clock instinct this time, guided me in. For we are creatures of habit, especially of the tea habit. The unoccupied table to which I drifted was in a shady corner not very far from the pay desk, and here I had been seated less than a minute when a lady passed me on her way to the farther table. The glimpse that I caught of her as she approached, it was but a glimpse, since she passed behind me, showed that she was dressed in black, that she wore a beaded veil and hat, and in addition to the glass of milk and the bun that she carried, she was encumbered by an umbrella and a small basket, apparently containing some kind of needlework. I must confess that I gave her very little attention at the time, being occupied in anxious speculation as to how long it would be before the fact of my presence would impinge on the consciousness of the waitress. The exact time of the clock on the wall was 3 minutes and a quarter, at the expiration of which an anemic young woman sauntered up to the table and bestowed on me a glance of sullen interrogation, as if mutely demanding what the devil I wanted. I humbly requested that I might be provided with a pot of tea, whereupon she turned on her heel, which was a good deal worn down on the off side, and reported my conduct to a lady behind a marble-topped counter. It seemed that the counter lady took a lenient view of the case, for in less than 4 minutes the waitress returned and gloomily deposited on the table before me a teapot, a milk jug, a cup and saucer, a jug of hot water, and a small pool of milk. Then she once more departed in dudgeon. I had just given the tea in the pot a preliminary stir, and was about to pour out the first cup, when I felt some one bump lightly against my chair and heard something rattle on the floor. I turned quickly and perceived the lady, whom I had seen enter, stooping just behind my chair. It seemed that having finished her frugal meal she was on her way out, when she had dropped the little basket that I had noticed hanging from her wrist, which basket had promptly disgorged its entire contents on the floor. Now every one must have noticed the demon of agility that seems to enter into an inanimate object when it is dropped, and the apparently intelligent malice with which it discovers and rolls into the most inaccessible places. Here was a case in point. This particular basket had contained materials for oriental beadwork, and no sooner had it reached the floor than each item of its contents appeared to become possessed of a separate and particular devil, impelling it to travel at headlong speed to some remote and unapproachable corner as distant as possible from its fellows. As the only man, and almost the only person near, the duty of salvage agent manifestly devolved upon me, and down I went, accordingly, on my hands and knees, regardless of a nearly new pair of trousers, to grope under tables, chairs, and settles in reach of the scattered treasure. A ball of the thick thread or twine I recovered from a dark and dirty corner after a brief interview with the sharp corner of a settle, and a multitude of the large beads with which this infernal industry is carried on I gathered from all parts of the compass, coming forth at length quadrupedally with a double handful of the treasure trove, and a very lively appreciation of the resistant qualities of a cast iron table stand when applied to the human cranium. The owner of the lost and found property was greatly distressed by the accident and the trouble it had cost me. In fact, she was quite needlessly agitated about it. The hand which held the basket into which I poured the rescued trash trembled visibly, and the brief glance that I bestowed on her as she murmured her thanks and apologies, with a very slight foreign accent, showed me that she was excessively pale. That much I could see plainly in spite of the rather dim light in this part of the shop and the beaded veil that covered her face. And I could also see that she was a rather remarkable looking woman, with a great mass of harsh black hair and very broad black eyebrows that nearly met above her nose and contrasted strikingly with the dead white of her skin. But, of course, I did not look at her intently. Having returned her property and received her acknowledgments, I resumed my seat and left her to go on her way. I had once more grasped the handle of the teapot when I made a rather curious discovery. At the bottom of the teacup lay a single lump of sugar. To the majority of persons it would have meant nothing. They would have assumed that they had dropped it in and forgotten it, and would have proceeded to pour out the tea. But it happened that, at this time, I did not take sugar in my tea, whence it followed that the lump had not been put in by me. Assuming, therefore, that it had been carelessly dropped in by the waitress, I turned it out on the table, filled the cup, added the milk, and took a tentative draught to test the temperature. The cup was yet at my lips when I chanced to look into the mirror that faced my table. Of course it reflected the part of the shop that was behind me, including the cashier's desk, at which the owner of the basket now stood paying for her refreshment. Between her and me was a gas chandelier, which cast its light on my back, but full on her face, and her veil notwithstanding, I could see that she was looking at me steadily, was, in fact, watching me intently and with a very curious expression, an expression of expectancy mingled with alarm. But this was not all. As I returned her intent look, which I could do unobserved, since my face, reflected in the mirror, was in deep shadow, I suddenly perceived that that steady gaze engaged her right eye only. The other eye was looking sharply towards her left shoulder. In short, she had a divergent squint of the left eye. I put down my cup with a thrill of amazement and a sudden surging up of suspicion and alarm. An instant's reflection reminded me that when she had spoken to me a few moments before, both her eyes had looked into mine without the slightest trace of a squint. My thoughts flew back to the lump of sugar, to the unguarded milk jug, and the draught of tea that I had already swallowed, and, hardly knowing what I intended, I started to my feet and turned to confront her. But as I rose, she snatched up her change and darted from the shop. Through the glass door I saw her spring onto the footboard of a passing hansom and give the driver some direction. I saw the man whip up his horse, and, by the time I reached the door, the cab was moving off swiftly down Sloane Street. I stood irresolute, and could not run out of the shop without making a fuss, and my hat and stick were still on the rail opposite my seat. The woman ought to be followed, but I had no fancy for the task. If the tea that I had swallowed was innocuous, no harm was done and I was rid of my pursuer. So far as I was concerned, the incident was closed. I went back to my seat, and picking up the lump of sugar which still lay on the table, where I had dropped it, put it carefully in my pocket. But my appetite for tea was satisfied for the present. Moreover, it was hardly advisable to stay in the shop lest some fresh spy should come to see how I fared. Accordingly, I obtained my check, handed it in the cashier's desk, and took my departure. All this time, it will be observed, I had been taking it for granted that the lady in black had followed me from Kensington to this shop; that, in fact, she was none other than Mrs. Schallibaum; and, indeed, the circumstances had rendered the conclusion inevitable. In the very instant when I had perceived the displacement of the left eye, complete recognition had come upon me. When I had stood facing the woman, the brief glance at her face had conveyed to me something dimly reminiscent of which I had been but half conscious and had instantly forgotten. But the sight of that characteristic squint had at once revived and explained it. That the woman was Mrs. Schallibaum I now felt no doubt whatever. Nevertheless, the whole affair was profoundly mysterious. As to the change in the woman's appearance, there was little in that. The coarse black hair might be her own, dyed, or it might be a wig. The eyebrows were made up. It was a simple enough proceeding, and made still more simple by the beaded veil. But how did she come to be there at all? How did she happen to be made up in this fashion at this particular time? And, above all, how came she to be provided with a lump of what I had little doubt was poisoned sugar? I turned over the events of the day, and the more I considered them the less comprehensible they appeared. No one had followed the omnibus either on foot or in a vehicle, as far as I could see, and I had kept a careful lookout, not only at starting, but for some considerable time after. Yet all the time Mrs. Schallibaum must have been following. But how? If she had known that I was intending to travel by the omnibus, she might have gone to meet it and enter it before I did. But she could not have known, and moreover she did not meet the omnibus, for we watched its approach from some considerable distance. I considered whether she might have been concealed in the house and overheard me mention my destination to Thorndyke, but this failed to explain the mystery, since I had mentioned no address beyond Kensington. I had, indeed, mentioned the name of Mrs. Hornby, but the supposition that my friends might be known by name to Mrs. Schallibaum, or even that she might have looked the name up in the directory, presented a probability too remote to be worth entertaining. But, if I reached no satisfactory conclusion, my cogitations had one useful effect. They occupied my mind to the exclusion of that unfortunate draught of tea. Not that I had been seriously uneasy after the first shock. The quantity that I had swallowed was not large, the tea being hotter than I cared for, and I remembered that, when I had thrown out the lump of sugar, I had turned the cup upside down on the table, so there could have been nothing solid left in it. And the lump of sugar was in itself reassuring, for it certainly would not have been used in conjunction with any less conspicuous but more incriminating form of poison. That lump of sugar was now in my pocket, reserved for careful examination at my leisure, and I reflected with a faint grin that it would be a little disconcerting if it would turn out to contain nothing but sugar after all. End of Chapter 10, Part 1. Part 2 of The Mystery of 31 New Inn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mystery of 31 New Inn by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 10. The Hunter Hunted. Part 2. On leaving the tea shop, I walked up Sloane Street with the intention of doing what I ought to have done earlier in the day. I was going to make perfectly sure that no spy was dogging my footsteps. But for my ridiculous confidence, I could have done so quite easily before going to Ensley Gardens. And now, made wiser by a startling experience, I proceeded with systematic care. It was still broad daylight, for the lamps in the tea shop had been rendered necessary only by the faulty construction of the premises and the dullness of the afternoon, and in an open space I could see far enough for complete safety. Arriving at the top of Sloane Street, I crossed Knightsbridge, and entering Hyde Park, struck out towards the Serpentine. Passing along the eastern shore, I entered one of the long paths that lead towards the Marble Arch, and strode along it at such a pace as would make it necessary for any pursuer to hurry in order to keep me in sight. Half way across the great stretch of turf, I halted for a few moments, and noted the few people who were coming in my direction. Then I turned sharply to the left, and headed straight for the Victoria Gate, but again, half way, I turned off among a clump of trees, and, standing behind the trunk of one of them, took a fresh survey of the people who were moving along the paths. All were at a considerable distance, and none appeared to be coming my way. I now moved cautiously from one tree to another, and passed through the wooded region to the south, crossed the Serpentine Bridge at a rapid walk, and hurrying along the south shore, left the park by Apsley House. From hence I walked at the same rapid pace along Piccadilly, insinuating myself among the crowd with the skill born of long acquaintance with the London streets, crossed amidst the seething traffic at the Circus, darted up Windmill Street, and began to zigzag amongst the narrow streets and courts of Soho. Crossing the Seven Dials and Drury Lane, I passed through the multitudinous back streets and alleys that then filled the area south of Lincoln's Inn, came out by Newcastle Street, Holywell Street, and Half Moon Alley into the Strand, which I crossed immediately, ultimately entering the Temple by Devereux Court. Even then I did not relax my precautions. From one court to another I passed quickly, loitering in those dark entries and unexpected passages that are known to so few but the regular Templars, and coming out into the open only at the last where the wide passage of King's Bench Walk admits of no evasion. Half way up the stairs I stood for some time in the shadow, watching the approaches from the staircase window. And when, at length, I felt satisfied that I had taken every precaution that was possible, I inserted my key and let myself into our chambers. Thorndyke had already arrived, and, as I entered, he rose to greet me with an expression of evident relief. "I'm glad to see you, Jervis," he said. "I have been rather anxious about you." "Why?" I asked. "For several reasons. One is that you are the sole danger that threatens these people, as far as they know. Another is that we made a most ridiculous mistake. We overlooked a fact that ought to have struck us instantly. But how have you fared?" "Better than I deserved. That good lady stuck to me like a burr. At least I believe she did." "I have no doubt she did. We have been caught napping finely, Jervis." "How?" "We'll go into that presently. Let us hear about your adventures first." I gave him a full account of my movements from the time when we parted to that of my arrival home, omitting no incident that I was able to remember, and as far as I could, reconstituting my exceedingly devious homeward route. "Your retreat was masterly," he remarked with a broad smile. "I should think that it would have utterly defeated any pursuer, and the only pity is that it was probably wasted on the desert air. Your pursuer had by that time become a fugitive. But you were wise to take these precautions, for, of course, Weiss might have followed you." "But I thought he was in Hamburg." "Did you? You are a very confiding young gentleman for a budding medical jurist. Of course, we don't know that he is not. But the fact that he has given Hamburg as his present whereabouts establishes a strong presumption that he is somewhere else. I only hope that he has not located you, and from what you tell me of your later methods, I fancy that you would have shaken him off even if he had started to follow you from the tea shop." "I hope so too. But how did that woman manage to stick to me in that way? What was the mistake we made?" Thorndyke laughed grimly. "It was a perfectly asinine mistake, Jervis. You started up Kennington Park Road on a leisurely, jog-trotting omnibus, and neither you nor I remembered what there is underneath Kennington Park Road." "Underneath!" I exclaimed, completely puzzled for the moment. Then, suddenly realizing what he meant, "Of course!" I exclaimed. "Idiot that I am! You mean the electric railway." "Yes. That explains everything. Mrs. Schallibaum must have watched us from some shop and quietly followed us up the lane. There were a good many women about, and several were walking in our direction. There was nothing to distinguish her from the others unless you had recognized her, which you would hardly have been able to do if she had worn a veil and kept at a fair distance. At least I think not." "No," I agreed. "I certainly should not. I had only seen her in a half dark room. In outdoor clothes and with a veil, I should never have been able to identify her without very close inspection. Besides, there was the disguise or make-up." "Not at that time. She would hardly come disguised to her own house, for it might have led to her being challenged and asked who she was. I think we may take it that there was no actual disguise, although she would probably wear a shady hat and a veil, which would have prevented either of us from picking her out from the other women in the street." "And what do you think happened next?" "I think that she simply walked past us, probably on the other side of the road, as we stood waiting for the omnibus, and turned up Kennington Park Road. She probably guessed that we were waiting for the omnibus, and walked up the road in the direction in which it was going. Presently the omnibus would pass her, and there were you in full view on top, keeping a vigilant lookout in the wrong direction. Then she would quicken her pace a little, and in a minute or two would arrive at the Kennington station of the South London Railway. In a minute or two more she would be in one of the electric trains whirling along under the street on which your omnibus was crawling. She would get out at the Borough station, or she might take a more risky chance and go on to the Monument. But in any case she would wait for your omnibus, hail it, and get inside. I suppose you took up some passengers on the way?" "Oh dear, yes. We were stopping every 2 or 3 minutes to take up or set down passengers, and most of them were women." "Very well. Then we may take it that when you arrived at the Mansion House, Mrs. Schallibaum was one of your inside passengers. It was a rather quaint situation, I think." "Yes, confound her! What a couple of noodles she must have thought us!" "No doubt, and that is the one consoling feature in the case. She will have taken us for a pair of absolute greenhorns. But to continue. Of course she travelled in your omnibus to Kensington. You ought to have gone inside on both occasions, so that you could see every one who entered and examine the inside passengers. She will have followed you to Ensley Gardens and probably noted the house you went to. Then she will have followed you to the restaurant, and may even have lunched there." "It is quite possible," said I. "There were 2 rooms, and they were filled principally with women." "Then she will have followed you to Sloane Street, and, as you persisted in riding outside, she could easily take an inside place in your omnibus. As to the theatre, she must have taken it as a veritable gift of the gods, an arrangement made by you for her special convenience." "Why?" "My dear fellow, consider. She had only to follow you in and see you safely into your seat, and there you were, left till called for. She could then go home, make up for her part, draw out a plan of action, with the help, perhaps, of Mr. Weiss, provide herself with the necessary means and appliances, and, at the appointed time, call and collect you." "That is assuming a good deal," I objected. "It is assuming, for instance, that she lives within a moderate distance of Sloane Square. Otherwise it would have been impossible." "Exactly. That is why I assume it. You don't suppose that she goes about habitually with lumps of prepared sugar in her pocket? And if not, then she must have got that lump from somewhere. Then the beads suggest a carefully prepared plan, and as I said just now, she can hardly have been made up when she met us in Kennington Lane. From all of which it seems likely that her present abode is not very far from Sloane Square." "At any rate," said I, "it was taking a considerable risk. I might have left the theatre before she came back." "Yes," Thorndyke agreed. "But it is like a woman to take chances. A man would probably have stuck to you, when once he had got you off your guard. But she was ready to take chances. She chanced the railway, and it came off, and she chanced your remaining in the theatre, and that came off too. She calculated on the probability of your getting tea when you came out, and she hit it off again. And then she took one chance too many. She assumed that you probably took sugar in your tea, and she was wrong." "We are taking it for granted that the sugar was prepared," I remarked. "Yes, our explanation is entirely hypothetical and may be entirely wrong. But it all hangs together, and if we find any poisonous matter in the sugar, it will be reasonable to assume that we are right. The sugar is the experimentum crucis. If you will hand it over to me, we will go up to the laboratory and make a preliminary test or 2. I took the lump of sugar from my pocket and gave it to him, and he carried it to the gas burner, by the light of which he examined it with a lens. "I don't see any foreign crystals on the surface," said he. "But we had better make a solution and go to work systematically. If it contains any poison, we may assume that it will be some alkaloid, though I will test for arsenic too. But a man of Weiss's type could almost certainly use an alkaloid, on account of its smaller bulk and more ready solubility. You ought not to have carried this loose in your pocket. For legal purposes that would seriously interfere with its value as evidence. Bodies that are suspected of containing poison should be carefully isolated and preserved from contact with anything that might lead to doubt in the analysis. It doesn't matter much to us, as this analysis is only for our own information, and we can satisfy ourselves as to the state of your pocket. But bear the rule in mind another time." We now ascended to the laboratory, where Thorndyke proceeded at once to dissolve the lump of sugar in a measured quantity of distilled water by the aid of gentle heat. "Before we add any acid," said he, "or introduce any fresh matter, we will adopt the simple preliminary measure of tasting the solution. The sugar is a disturbing factor, but some of the alkaloids and most mineral poisons, excepting arsenic, have a very characteristic taste." He dipped a glass rod in the warm solution and applied it gingerly to his tongue. "Ha!" he exclaimed, as he carefully wiped his mouth with his handkerchief. "Simple methods are often very valuable. There isn't much doubt as to what is in that sugar. Let me recommend my learned brother to try the flavor. But be careful. A little of this will go a long way." He took a fresh rod from the rack, and, dipping it in the solution, handed it to me. I cautiously applied it to the tip of my tongue, and was immediately aware of a peculiar tingling sensation, accompanied by a feeling of numbness. "Well," said Thorndyke, "what is it?" "Aconite," I replied without hesitation. "Yes," he agreed, "aconite it is, or more probably aconitine. And that, I think, gives us all the information we want. We need not trouble now to make a complete analysis, though I shall have a quantitative examination made later. You note the intensity of the taste, and you see what the strength of the solution is. Evidently that lump of sugar contained a very large dose of the poison. If the sugar had been dissolved in your tea, the quantity that you drank would have contained enough aconitine to lay you out within a few minutes, which would account for Mrs. Schallibaum's anxiety to get clear of the premises. She saw you drink from the cup, but I imagine she had not seen you turn the sugar out." "No, I should say not, to judge by her expression. She looked terrified. She is not as hardened as her rascally companion." "Which is fortunate for you, Jervis. If she had not been in such a fluster, she would have waited until you had poured out your tea, which was what she probably meant to do, or have dropped the sugar into the milk jug. In either case you would have got a poisonous dose before you noticed anything amiss." "They are a pretty pair, Thorndyke," I exclaimed. "A human life seems to be no more to them than the life of a fly or a beetle." "No, that is so. They are typical poisoners of the worst kind, of the intelligent, cautious, resourceful kind. They are a standing menace to society. As long as they are at large, human lives are in danger, and it is our business to see that they do not remain at large a moment longer than is unavoidable. And that brings us to another point. You had better keep indoors for the next few days." "Oh, nonsense!" I protested. "I can take care of myself." "I won't dispute that," said Thorndyke, "although I might. But the matter is of vital importance, and we can't be too careful. Yours is the only evidence that could convict these people. They know that, and will stick at nothing to get rid of you, for by this time they will almost certainly have ascertained that the tea shop plan has failed. Now your life is of some value to you, and to another person whom I could mention. But apart from that, you are the indispensable instrument for ridding society of these dangerous vermin. Moreover, if you were seen abroad and connected with these chambers, they would get the information that their case was really being investigated in a businesslike manner. If Weiss has not already left the country, he would do so immediately, and if he has, Mrs. Schallibaum would join him at once, and we might never be able to lay hands on them. You must stay indoors, out of sight, and you had better write to Miss Gibson and ask her to warn the servants to give no information about you to anyone." "And how long," I asked, "am I to be held on parole?" "Not long, I think. We have a very promising start. If I have any luck, I shall be able to collect all the evidence I want in about a week. But there is an element of chance in some of it which prevents me from giving a date. And it is just possible that I may have started on a false track. But that I shall be able to tell you better in a day or two." "And I suppose," I said gloomily, "I shall be out of the hunt altogether?" "Not at all," he replied. "You have got the Blackmore case to attend to. I shall hand you over all the documents and get you to make an orderly digest of the evidence. You will then have all the facts and can work out the case for yourself. Also, I shall ask you to help Polton in some little operations which are designed to throw light into dark places, and which you will find both entertaining and instructive. Supposing Mrs. Hornby should propose to call, and take tea with us in the gardens," I suggested. "And bring Miss Gibson with her," Thorndyke added dryly. "No, Jervis, it would never do. You must make that quite clear to her. It is more probable than not that Mrs. Schallibaum made a careful note of the house in Ensley Gardens, and as that would be the one place actually known to her, she and Weiss, if he is in England, would almost certainly keep a watch on it. If they should succeed in connecting that house with these chambers, a few inquiries would show them the exact state of the case. No, we must keep them in the dark if we possibly can. We have shown too much of our hand already. It is hard on you, but it cannot be helped." "Oh, don't think I am complaining," I exclaimed. "If it is a matter of business, I am as keen as you are. I thought at first that you were merely considering the safety of my vile body. When shall I start on my job?" "Tomorrow morning. I shall give you my notes on the Blackmore case and the copies of the will and the depositions, from which you had better draw up a digest of the evidence, with remarks as to the conclusions that it suggests. Then there are our gleanings from New Inn to be looked over and considered. And with regard to this case, we have the fragments of a pair of spectacles, which had better be put together into a rather more intelligible form, in case we have to produce them in evidence. That will keep you occupied for a day or two, together with some work appertaining to other cases. And now let us dismiss professional topics. You have not dined, and neither have I, but I dare say Polton has made arrangements for some sort of meal. We will go down and see." We descended to the lower floor, where Thorndyke's anticipations were justified by a neatly laid table, to which Polton was giving the finishing touches. End of chapter 10, part 2.
Chapter 11 of The Mystery of 31 New Inn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stephen Seidel. The Mystery of 31 New Inn by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 11. The Blackmore Case Reviewed. One of the conditions of medical practice is the capability of transferring one's attention at a moment's notice from one set of circumstances to another, equally important but entirely unrelated. At each visit on his round, the practitioner finds himself concerned with a particular self-contained group of phenomena, which he must consider at the moment with the utmost concentration, but which he must instantly dismiss from his mind as he moves on to the next case. It is a difficult habit to acquire, for an important, distressing, or obscure case is apt to take possession of the consciousness and hinder the exercise of attention that succeeding cases demand. But experience shows the faculty to be indispensable, and the practitioner learns, in time, to forget everything but the patient with whose condition he is occupied at the moment. My first morning's work on the Blackmore case showed me that the same faculty is demanded in legal practice, and it also showed me that I had yet to acquire it, for, as I looked over the depositions and the copy of the will, memories of the mysterious house in Kennington Lane continually intruded into my reflections, and the figure of Mrs. Schallibaum, white-faced, terrified, expectant, haunted me continually. In truth, my interest in the Blackmore case was little more than academic, whereas in the Kennington case I was one of the parties and was personally concerned. To me, John Blackmore was but a name, Geoffrey but a shadowy figure to which I could assign no definite personality, and Stephen himself but a casual stranger. Mr. Graves, on the other hand, was a real person. I had seen him amidst the tragic circumstances that had probably heralded his death, and had brought away with me not only a lively recollection of him, but a feeling of profound pity and concern as to his fate. The villain Weiss, too, and the terrible woman who aided, abetted, and perhaps even directed him, lived on in my memory as vivid and dreadful realities. Although I had uttered no hint to Thorndyke I lamented inwardly that I had not been given some work, if there was any to do, connected with this case, in which I was so deeply interested, rather than with the dry, purely legal, and utterly bewildering case of Geoffrey Blackmore's will. Nevertheless, I stuck loyally to my task. I read through the depositions and the will, without getting a single glimmer of fresh light on the case, and I made a careful digest of all the facts. I compared my digest with Thorndyke's notes, of which I also made a copy, and found that, brief as they were, they contained several matters that I had overlooked. I also drew up a brief account of our visit to New Inn, with a list of the objects that we had observed or collected, and then I addressed myself to the second part of my task, the statement of my conclusions from the facts set forth. It was only when I came to make the attempt that I realized how completely I was at sea. In spite of Thorndyke's recommendation to study Marchmont's statement as it was summarized in those notes which I had copied, and of his hint that I should find in that statement something highly significant, I was borne irresistibly to one conclusion, and one only, and the wrong one at that, as I suspected, that Geoffrey Blackmore's will was a perfectly regular, sound, and valid document. I tried to attack the validity of the will from various directions, and failed every time. As to its genuineness, that was obviously not in question. There seemed to me only two conceivable respects in which any objection could be raised, viz., the competency of Geoffrey to execute a will, and the possibility of undue influence having been brought to bear on him. With reference to the first, there was the undoubted fact that Geoffrey was addicted to the opium habit, and this might, under some circumstances, interfere with a testator's competency to make a will. But had any such circumstances existed in this case? Had the drug habit produced such mental changes in the deceased as would destroy or weaken his judgment? There was not a particle of evidence in favor of any such belief. Up to the very end, he had managed his own affairs, and, if his habits of life had undergone a change, they were still the habits of a perfectly sane and responsible man. The question of undue influence was more difficult. If it applied to any person in particular, that person could be none other than John Blackmore. Now, it was an undoubted fact that, of all Geoffrey's acquaintance, his brother John was the only one who knew that he was in residence at New Inn. Moreover, John had visited him there more than once. It was therefore possible that influence might have been brought to bear on the deceased. But there was no evidence that it had. The fact that a deceased man's only brother should be the one person who knew where he was living was not a remarkable one, and it had been satisfactorily explained by the necessity of Geoffrey's finding a reference on applying for the chambers. And against the theory of undue influence was the fact that the testator had voluntarily brought his will to the lodge and executed it in the presence of entirely disinterested witnesses. In the end I had to give up the problem in despair, and, abandoning the documents, turned my attention to the facts elicited by our visit to New Inn. What had we learned from our exploration? It was clear that Thorndyke had picked up some facts that had appeared to him important. But important in what respect? The only possible issue that could be raised was the validity, or otherwise, of Geoffrey Blackmore's will. And since the validity of that will was supported by positive evidence of the most incontestable kind, it seemed to me that nothing we had observed could have any real bearing on the case at all. But of course this could not be. Thorndyke was no dreamer, nor was he addicted to wild speculation. If the facts observed by us seemed to him to be relevant to the case, I was prepared to assume that they were relevant, although I could not see their connection with it. And, on this assumption, I proceeded to examine them afresh. Now, whatever Thorndyke might have observed on his own account, I had brought away from the dead man's chambers only a single fact, and a very extraordinary fact it was. The cuneiform inscription was upside down. That was the sum of the evidence that I had collected. And the question was, what did it prove? To Thorndyke it conveyed some deep significance. What could that significance be? The inverted position was not a mere temporary accident, as it might have been if the frame had been stood on a shelf for support. It was hung on the wall, and the plates screwed on the frame showed that its position was permanent, and that it had never hung in any other. That it could have been hung up by Geoffrey himself was clearly inconceivable. But, allowing that it had been fixed in its present position by some workman when the new tenant moved in, the fact remained that there it had hung, presumably for months, and that Geoffrey Blackmore, with his expert knowledge of the cuneiform character, had never noticed that it was upside down. Or, if he had noticed it, that he had never taken the trouble to have it altered. What could this mean? If he had noticed the error, but had not troubled to correct it, that would point to a very singular state of mind, an inertness and indifference remarkable even in an opium smoker. But assuming such a state of mind, I could not see that it had any bearing on the will, excepting that it was rather inconsistent with the tendency to make fussy and needless alterations which the testator had actually shown. On the other hand, if he had not noticed the inverted position of the photograph, he must have been nearly blind or quite idiotic, for the photograph was over 2 feet long and the characters large enough to be read easily by a person of ordinary eyesight at a distance of 40 to 50 feet. Now, he was obviously not in a state of dementia, whereas his eyesight was admittedly bad, and it seemed to me that the only conclusion deducible from the photograph was that it furnished a measure of the badness of the deceased man's vision, that it proved him to have been verging on total blindness. But there was nothing startling new in this. He had himself declared that he was fast losing his sight. And again, what was the bearing of his partial blindness on the will? A totally blind man cannot draw up his will at all. But if he has eyesight sufficient to enable him to write out and sign a will, mere defective vision will not lead him to muddle the provisions. Yet something of this kind seemed to be in Thorndyke's mind, for now I recalled the question that he had put to the porter. "When you read the will over in Mr. Blackmore's presence, did you read it aloud?" That question could have but one significance. It implied a doubt as to whether the testator was fully aware of the exact nature of the document that he was signing. Yet, if he was able to write it and sign it, surely he was able also to read it through, to say nothing of the fact that, unless he was demented, he must have remembered what he had written. Thus, once more, my reasoning only led me into a blind alley, at the end of which was the will, regular and valid and fulfilling all the requirements that the law imposed. Once again I had to confess myself beaten and in full agreement with Mr. Marchmont that there was no case, that there was nothing in dispute. Nevertheless, I carefully fixed in the pocket file that Thorndyke had given me the copy that I had made of his notes, together with the notes on our visit to New Inn, and the few and unsatisfactory conclusions at which I had arrived. And this brought me to the end of my first morning in my new capacity. "And how," Thorndyke asked as we sat at lunch, "has my learned friend progressed? Does he propose that we advise Mr. Marchmont to enter a caveat?" "I read all the documents and boiled all the evidence down to a stiff jelly, and I am in a worse fog than ever. There seems to be a slight mixture of metaphors in my learned friend's remarks. But never mind the fog, Jervis. There is a certain virtue in fog. It serves, like a picture frame, to surround the essential with a neutral zone that separates it from the irrelevant." "That is a very profound observation, Thorndyke," I remarked ironically. "I was just thinking so myself," he rejoined. And if you could contrive to explain what it means? Oh, but that is unreasonable. When one throws off a subtly philosophic obiter dictum, one looks to the discerning critic to supply the meaning. By the way, I am going to introduce you to the gentle art of photography this afternoon. I am getting the loan of all the cheques that were drawn by Geoffrey Blackmore during his residence at New Inn. There are only 23 of them, all told, and I am going to photograph them. I shouldn't have thought the bank people would have let them go out of their possession. They're not going to. One of the partners, a Mr. Britton, is bringing them here himself and will be present while the photographs are being taken. So they will not go out of his custody. But, all the same, it is a great concession, and I should not have obtained it but for the fact that I have done a good deal of work for the bank and that Mr. Britton is more or less a personal friend. By the way, how comes it that the cheques are at the bank? Why were they not returned to Geoffrey with a pass-book in the usual way? I understand from Britton, replied Thorndyke, that all Geoffrey's cheques were retained by the bank at his request. When he was travelling, he used to leave his investment securities and other valuable documents in his banker's custody, and, as he has never applied to have them returned, the bankers still have them and are retaining them until the will is proved, when they will, of course, hand over everything to the executors. What is the object of photographing these cheques? I asked. There are several objects. First, since a good photograph is practically as good as the original, when we have the photographs, we practically have the cheques for reference. Then, since a photograph can be duplicated indefinitely, it would be possible to perform experiments on it which involve its destruction, which would of course be impossible in the case of original cheques. But the ultimate object, what are you going to prove? You are incorrigible, Jervis, he exclaimed. How should I know what I am going to prove? This is an investigation. If I knew the results beforehand, I shouldn't want to perform the experiment. He looked at his watch, and as we rose from the table he said, "If we have finished, we had better go up to the laboratory and see that the apparatus is ready. Mr. Britton is a busy man, and, as he is doing us a great service, we mustn't keep him waiting when he comes." We ascended to the laboratory, where Polton was already busy inspecting the massively built copying camera, which, with the long steel guides on which the easel or copy holder travelled, took up the whole length of the room on the side opposite to that occupied by the chemical bench. As I was to be inducted into the photographic art, I looked at it with more attention than I had ever done before. "We've made some improvements since you were here last, sir," said Polton, who was delicately lubricating the steel guides. "We've fitted these steel runners instead of the black leaded wooden ones that we used to have, and we've made 2 scales instead of 1. Hello! That's the downstairs bell. Shall I go, sir?" "Perhaps you'd better," said Thorndyke. "It may not be Mr. Britton, and I don't want to be caught in delay just now." However, it was Mr. Britton, a breezy, alert-looking, middle-aged man, who came in escorted by Polton and shook our hands cordially, having been previously warned of my presence. He carried a small but solid handbag, to which he clung tenaciously up to the very moment when its contents were required for use. "So that is the camera," said he, running an inquisitive eye over the instrument. "Very fine one, too. I am a bit of a photographer myself. What is that graduation on the sidebar?" "Those are the scales," replied Thorndyke. "That shows the degree of magnification or reduction. The pointer is fixed to the easel and travels with it, of course, showing the exact size of the photograph. When the pointer is opposite 0, the photograph will be identical in size with the object photographed. When it points to, say, ×6, the photograph will be 6 times as long as the object, or magnified 36 times superficially, whereas if the pointer is at divide by 6, the photograph will be 1/6 of the length of the object, or 1/36 superficial." "Why are there two scales?" Mr. Britton asked. "There is a separate scale for each of the two lenses that we principally used. For great magnification or reduction, a lens of comparatively short focus must be used; but as a long focus lens gives us a more perfect image, we use one of very long focus, 36 inches, for copying the same size or for slight magnification or reduction." "Are you going to magnify these checks?" Mr. Britton asked. "Not in the first place," replied Thorndyke. "For convenience and speed I am going to photograph them half size, so that 6 checks will go on one whole plate. Afterwards we can enlarge from the negatives as much as we like. But we should probably enlarge only the signatures in any case." The precious bag was now opened and the 23 checks brought out and laid on the bench in a consecutive series in the order of their dates. They were then fixed by tapes, to avoid making pinholes in them, in batches of 6 to small drawing boards, each batch being so arranged that the signatures were towards the middle. The first board was clamped to the easel, the latter was slid along its guides until the pointer stood at divide by 2 on the long focus scale, and Thorndyke proceeded to focus the camera with the aid of a little microscope that Polton had made for the purpose. When Mr. Britton and I had inspected the exquisitely sharp image on the focusing screen through the microscope, Polton introduced the plate and made the first exposure, carrying the dark slide off to develop the plate while the next batch of checks was being fixed in position. In his photographic technique, as in everything else, Polton followed as closely as he could the methods of his principal and instructor, methods characterized by that unhurried precision that leads to perfect accomplishment. When the first negative was brought forth, dripping, from the dark room, it was without spot or stain, scratch or pinhole, uniform in colour, and of exactly the required density. The 6 checks shown on it, ridiculously small in appearance, though only reduced to half length, looked as clear and sharp as fine etchings, though, to be sure, my opportunity for examining them was rather limited, for Polton was uncommonly careful to keep the wet plate out of reach, and so safe from injury. "Well," said Mr. Britton, when, at the end of our séance, he returned his treasures to the bag, "you have now got 23 of our checks to all intents and purposes. I hope you are not going to make any unlawful use of them. Must tell our cashiers to keep a bright lookout, and," here he lowered his voice impressively and addressed himself to me and Polton, "you understand that this is a private matter between Dr. Thorndyke and me. Of course, as Mr. Blackmore is dead, there is no reason why his check should not be photographed for legal purposes. But we don't want it talked about, nor, I think, does Dr. Thorndyke." "Certainly not," Thorndyke agreed emphatically. "But you need not be uneasy, Mr. Britton. We are very uncommunicative people in this establishment." As my colleague and I escorted our visitor down the stairs, he returned to the subject of the checks. "I don't understand what you want them for," he remarked. "There is no question turning on the signatures in the case of the Blackmore deceased, is there?" "I should say not," Thorndyke replied, rather evasively. "I should say very decidedly not," said Mr. Britton, "if I understood Marchmont aright. And even if there were, let me tell you, these signatures that you have got wouldn't help you. I have looked them over very closely, and I have seen a few signatures in my time, you know. Marchmont asked me to glance over them as a matter of form, but I don't believe in matters of form. I examined them very carefully. There is an appreciable amount of variation, a very appreciable amount, but under the variation one can trace the personal character, which is what matters, the subtle, indescribable quality that makes it recognizable to the expert eye as Geoffrey Blackmore's writing. You understand me. There is such a quality which remains when the coarser characteristics vary. Just as a man may grow old or fat or bald, or may take a drink and become quite changed, and yet through it all he preserves a certain something which makes him recognizable as a member of a particular family. Well, I find that quality in all those signatures, and so will you, if you have had enough experience of handwriting. I thought it best to mention it in case you might be giving yourself unnecessary trouble." "It is very good of you," said Thorndyke, "and I need not say that the information is of great value, coming from such a highly expert source. As a matter of fact, your hint will be of great value to me." He shook hands with Mr. Britton, and, as the latter disappeared down the stairs, he turned into the sitting room and remarked: "There is a very weighty and significant observation, Jervis. I advise you to consider it attentively in all its bearings." "You mean the fact that the signatures are undoubtedly genuine?" "I meant, rather, the very interesting general truth that is contained in Britton's statement, that physiognomy is not a mere matter of facial character. A man carries his personal trademark, not in his face only, but in his nervous system and muscles, giving rise to characteristic movements and gait; in his larynx, producing an individual voice; and even in his mouth, as shown by individual peculiarities of speech and accent. And the individual nervous system, by means of those characteristic movements, transfers its peculiarities to inanimate objects that are the products of such movements, as we see in pictures, in carving, in musical execution and handwriting. No one has ever painted quite like Reynolds or Romney; no one has ever played exactly like Liszt or Paganini. The pictures or the sounds produced by them were, so to speak, an extension of the physiognomy of the artist. And so with handwriting. A particular specimen is the product of a particular set of motor centres in an individual brain." "These are very interesting considerations, Thorndyke," I remarked, "but I don't quite see their present application. Do you mean them to bear in any special way on the Blackmore case?" "I think they do bear on it, very directly. I thought so while Mr. Britton was making his very illuminating remarks." "I don't see how. In fact, I cannot see why you are going into the question of signatures at all. The signature on the will is admittedly genuine, and that seems to me to dispose of the whole affair." "My dear Jervis," said he, "you and Marchmont are allowing yourselves to be obsessed by a particular fact; a very striking and weighty fact, I will admit, but still only an isolated fact. Geoffrey Blackmore executed his will in a regular manner, complying with all the necessary formalities and conditions. In the face of that single circumstance you and Marchmont would 'chuck up the sponge,' as the old pugilists expressed it. Now that is a great mistake. You should never allow yourself to be bullied and browbeaten by a single fact." "But, my dear Thorndyke," I protested, "this fact seems to be final. It covers all the possibilities, unless you can suggest any other that would cancel it." "I could suggest a dozen," he replied. "Let us take an instance. Supposing Geoffrey executed this will for a wager; that he immediately revoked it and made a fresh will; that he placed the latter in the custody of some person, and that that person has suppressed it." "Oh, surely you do not make the suggestion seriously!" I exclaimed. "Certainly I do not," he replied with a smile. "I merely give it as an instance to show that your final and absolute fact is really only conditional on there being no other fact that cancels it." "Do you think he might have made a third will?" "It is obviously possible. A man who makes two wills may make three or more. But I may say that I see no present reason for assuming the existence of another will. What I want to impress on you is the necessity of considering all the facts, instead of bumping heavily against the most conspicuous one and forgetting all the rest. By the way, here is a little problem for you. What was the object of which these are the parts?" He pushed across the table a little cardboard box, having first removed the lid. In it were a number of very small pieces of broken glass, some of which had been cemented together by their edges. "These, I suppose," said I, looking with considerable curiosity at the little collection, "are the pieces of glass that we picked up in poor Blackmore's bedroom?" "Yes. You see that Polton has been endeavouring to reconstitute the object, whatever it was, but he has not been very successful. for the fragments were too small and irregular and the collection too incomplete. However, here is a specimen built up of 6 small pieces, which exhibits the general character of the object fairly well." He picked out the little irregularly shaped object and handed it to me, and I could not but admire the neatness with which Polton had joined the tiny fragments together. I took the little restoration and, holding it up before my eyes, moved it to and fro as I looked through it at the window. "It was not a lens," I pronounced eventually. "No," Thorndyke agreed, "it was not a lens." "And so it cannot have been a spectacle glass. But the surface was curved, one side convex and the other concave, and the little piece that remains of the original edge seems to have been ground to fit a bezel or a frame. I should say that these are portions of a watch glass." "That is Polton's opinion," said Thorndyke, "and I think you're both wrong." "What do you say to the glass of a miniature or locket?" "That is rather more probable, but it is not my view." "What do you think it is?" I asked. But Thorndyke was not to be drawn. "I am submitting the problem for solution by my learned friend," he replied with an exasperating smile. And then he added, "I don't say that you and Polton are wrong, only that I don't agree with you. Perhaps you had better make a note of the properties of this object and consider it at your leisure when you are ruminating on the other data referring to the Blackmore case." "My ruminations," I said, "always lead me back to the same point." "But you mustn't let them," he replied. "Shuffle your data about. Invent hypotheses. Never mind if they seem rather wild. Don't put them aside on that account. Take the first hypothesis that you can invent and test it thoroughly with your facts. You will probably have to reject it, but you will be certain to have learned something new. Then try again with a fresh one. You remember what I told you of my methods when I began this branch of practice and had plenty of time on my hands?" "I am not sure that I do." "Well, I used to occupy my leisure in constructing imaginary cases, mostly criminal, for the purpose of study and for the acquirement of experience. For instance, I would devise an ingenious fraud and would plan it in detail, taking every precaution that I could think of against failure or detection, considering and elaborately providing for every imaginable contingency. For the time being my entire attention was concentrated on it, making it as perfect and secure and undetectable as I could with the knowledge and ingenuity at my command. I behaved exactly as if I were proposing actually to carry it out, and my life or liberty depended on its success, excepting that I made full notes of every detail of the scheme. Then, when my plans were as complete as I could make them, and I could think of no way in which to improve them, I changed sides and considered the case from the standpoint of detection. I analyzed the case, I picked out its inherent and unavoidable weaknesses, and, especially, I noticed the respects in which a fraudulent proceeding of that particular kind differed from the bona fide proceeding that it simulated. The exercise was invaluable to me. I acquired as much experience from those imaginary cases as I should from real ones, and, in addition, I learned a method which is the one that I practice today." "Do you mean that you still invent imaginary cases as mental exercises?" "No, I mean that, when I have a problem of any intricacy, I invent a case which fits the facts and the assumed motives of one of the parties. Then I work at that case until I find whether it leads to elucidation or to some fundamental disagreement. In the latter case I reject it and begin the process over again." "Doesn't that method sometimes involve a good deal of wasted time and energy?" I asked. "No, because each time that you fail to establish a given case, you exclude a particular explanation of the facts and narrow down the field of inquiry. By repeating the process you are bound in the end to arrive at an imaginary case which fits all the facts. then your imaginary case is the real case, and the problem is solved. Let me recommend you to give the method a trial." I promised to do so, though with no very lively expectations as to the result, and with this the subject was allowed for the present to drop. End of chapter 11.
Of the Mystery of 31 New Inn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rosie. The Mystery of 31 New Inn by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 12. The Portrait. The state of mind which Thorndyke had advised me to cultivate was one that did not come easily. However much I endeavoured to shuffle the facts of the Blackmore case, there was one which inevitably turned up on the top of the pack. The circumstances surrounding the execution of Geoffrey Blackmore's will intruded into all my cogitations on the subject with hopeless persistency. That scene in the porter's lodge was to me what King Charles's head was to poor Mr. Dick. In the midst of my praiseworthy efforts to construct some intelligible scheme of the case, it would make its appearance and reduce my mind to instant chaos. For the next few days Thorndyke was very much occupied with one or two civil cases, which kept him in court during the whole of the sitting, and when he came home he seemed indisposed to talk on professional topics. Meanwhile, Polton worked steadily at the photographs of the signatures, and, with a view to gaining experience, I assisted him and watched his methods. In the present case, the signatures were enlarged from their original dimensions, rather less than 1.5 inches in length, to a length of 4.5 inches, which rendered all the little peculiarities of the handwriting surprisingly distinct and conspicuous. Each signature was eventually mounted on a slip of card bearing a number and the date of the cheque from which it was taken, so that it was possible to place any two signatures together for comparison. I looked over the whole series, and very carefully compared those which showed any differences, but without discovering anything more than might have been expected in view of Mr. Britton's statement. There were some trifling variations, but they were all very much alike, and no one could doubt, on looking at them, that they were all written by the same hand. As this, however, was apparently not in dispute, it furnished no new information. Thorndyke's object, for I felt certain that he had something definite in his mind, must be to test something apart from the genuineness of the signatures. But what could that something be? I dared not ask him, for questions of that kind were anathema, so there was nothing for it but to lie low and see what he would do with the photographs. The whole series was finished on the 4th morning after my adventure at Sloane Square, and the pack of cards was duly delivered by Polton when he brought in the breakfast tray. Thorndyke took up the pack somewhat with the air of a whist player, and, as he ran through them, I noticed that the number had increased from 23 to 24. The additional one, Thorndyke explained, is the signature to the first will, which was in Marchmont's possession. I have added it to the collection as it carries us back to an earlier date. The signature of the second will presumably resemble those of the cheques drawn about the same date, but that is not material, or, if it should become so, we could claim to examine the second will. He laid the cards out on the table in the order of their dates, and slowly ran his eye down the series. I watched him closely, and ventured presently to ask, "Do you agree with Mr. Britton as to the general identity of character in the whole set of signatures?" "Yes," he replied. "I should certainly have put them down as being all the signatures of one person. The variations are very slight. The later signatures are a little stiffer, a little more shaky and indistinct, and the B's and K's are both appreciably different from those in the earlier ones. But there is another fact which emerges when the whole series is seen together, and it is so striking and significant a fact, that I am astonished at its not having been remarked on by Mr. Britton." "Indeed," said I, stooping to examine the photographs with fresh interest. "What is that?" "It is a very simple fact and very obvious, but yet, as I have said, very significant. Look carefully at number 1, which is the signature of the first will, dated 3 years ago, and compare it with number 3, dated the 18th of September last year." "They look to me identical," said I, after a careful comparison. "So they do to me," said Thorndyke. "Neither of them shows the change that occurred later. But if you look at number 2, dated the 16th of September, you will see that it is in the later style. So is number 4, dated the 23rd of September, but numbers 5 and 6, both at the beginning of October, are in the earlier style, like the signature of the will. Thereafter, all the signatures are in the new style. But if you compare number 2, dated the 16th of September, with number 24, dated the 14th of March of this year, the day of Geoffrey's death, you see that they exhibit no difference. Both are in the later style, but the last shows no greater change than the first. Don't you consider these facts very striking and significant?" I reflected a few moments, trying to make out the deep significance to which Thorndyke was directing my attention, and not succeeding very triumphantly. "You mean," I said, "that the occasional reversions to the earlier form convey some material suggestion?" "Yes, but more than that. What we learn from an inspection of this series is this, that there was a change in the character of the signature, a very slight change, but quite recognizable. Now that change was not gradual or insidious, nor was it progressive. It occurred at a certain definite time. At first there were 1 or 2 reversions to the earlier form, but after number 6 the new style continued to the end, and you notice that it continued without any increase in the change and without any variation. There are no intermediate forms. Some of the signatures are in the old style and some in the new, but there are none that are half and half. So that, to repeat, we have here 2 types of signature, very much alike, but distinguishable. They alternate, but do not merge into one another to produce intermediate forms. The change occurs abruptly, but shows no tendency to increase as time goes on. It is not a progressive change. What do you make of that, Jervis?" "It is very remarkable," I said, poring over the cards to verify Thorndyke's statements. "I don't quite know what to make of it. If the circumstances admitted of the idea of forgery, one would suspect the genuineness of some of the signatures. But they don't, at any rate, in the case of the later will, to say nothing of Mr. Britton's opinion on the signatures." "Still," said Thorndyke, "there must be some explanation of the change in the character of the signatures, and that explanation cannot be the failing eyesight of the writer, for that is a gradually progressive and continuous condition, whereas the change in the writing is abrupt and intermittent." I considered Thorndyke's remark for a few moments, and then a light, though not a very brilliant one, seemed to break on me. "I think I see what you are driving at," said I. "You mean that the change in the writing must be associated with some new condition affecting the writer, and that that condition existed intermittently." Thorndyke nodded approvingly, and I continued, "The only intermittent condition that we know of is the effect of opium. So that we might consider the clearer signatures to have been made when Geoffrey was in his normal state, and the less distinct ones after a bout of opium smoking." "That is perfectly sound reasoning," said Thorndyke. "What further conclusion does it lead to?" "It suggests that the opium habit had been only recently acquired, since the change was noticed only about the time he went to live at New Inn, and since the change in the writing is at first intermittent and then continuous, we may infer that the opium smoking was at first occasional and later became a confirmed habit." "Quite a reasonable conclusion, and very clearly stated," said Thorndyke. "I don't say that I entirely agree with you, or that you have exhausted the information that these signatures offer, but you have started in the right direction." "I may be on the right road," I said gloomily, "but I am stuck fast in one place, and I see no chance of getting any further." "But you have a quantity of data," said Thorndyke. "You have all the facts that I had to start with, from which I constructed the hypothesis that I am now busily engaged in verifying. I have a few more data now, for as money makes money, so knowledge begets knowledge, and I put my original capital out to interest. Shall we tabulate the facts that are in our joint possession, and see what they suggest?" I grasped eagerly at the offer, though I had conned over my notes again and again. Thorndyke produced a slip of paper from a drawer, and, uncapping his fountain pen, proceeded to write down the leading facts, reading each aloud as soon as it was written. 1. The second will was unnecessary, since it contained no new matter, expressed no new intentions, and met no new conditions, and the first will was quite clear and efficient. 2. The evident intention of the testator was to leave the bulk of his property to Stephen Blackmore. 3. The second will did not, under existing circumstances, give effect to this intention, whereas the first will did. 4. The signature of the second will differs slightly from that of the first, and also from what had hitherto been the testator's ordinary signature. And now we come to a very curious group of dates, which I will advise you to consider with great attention. 5. Mrs. Wilson made her will at the beginning of September last year, without acquainting Geoffrey Blackmore, who seems to have been aware of the existence of this will. 6. His own second will was dated the 12th of November of last year. 7. Mrs. Wilson died of cancer on the 12th of March this present year. 8. Geoffrey Blackmore was last seen alive on the 14th of March. 9. His body was discovered on the 15th of March. 10. The change in the character of his signature began about September last year and became permanent after the middle of October. You will find that collection of facts repay careful study, Jervis, especially when considered in relation to the further data. 11. That we found in Blackmore's chambers a framed inscription of large size, hung upside down, together with what appeared to be the remains of a watch glass and a box of stearine candles, and some other objects. He passed the paper to me, and I pored over it intently, focusing my attention on the various items with all the power of my will. But, struggle as I would, no general conclusion could be made to emerge from the mass of apparently disconnected facts. "Well," Thorndyke said presently, after watching with grave interest my unavailing efforts, "what do you make of it?" "Nothing!" I exclaimed desperately, slapping the paper down on the table. "Of course, I can see that there are some queer coincidences, but how do they bear on the case? I understand that you want to upset this will, which we know to have been signed without compulsion or even suggestion in the presence of two respectable men, who have sworn to the identity of the document. That is your object, I believe?" "Certainly it is." "Then I am hanged if I see how you are going to do it. Not, I should say, by offering a group of vague coincidences that would muddle any brain but your own." Thorndyke chuckled softly, but pursued the subject no farther. "Put that paper in your file with your other notes," he said, "and think it over at your leisure. And now I want a little help from you. Have you a good memory for faces?" "Fairly good, I think. Why?" "Because I have a photograph of a man whom I think you may have met. Just look at it and tell me if you remember the face." He drew a cabinet-sized photograph from an envelope that had come by the morning's post, and handed it to me. "I have certainly seen this face somewhere," said I, taking the portrait over to the window to examine it more thoroughly, "but I can't, at the moment, remember where." "Try," said Thorndyke. "If you have seen the face before, you shall be able to recall the person." I looked intently at the photograph, and the more I looked, the more familiar did the face appear. Suddenly the identity of the man flashed into my mind, and I exclaimed in astonishment, "It can't be that poor creature at Kennington, Mr. Graves?" "I think it can," replied Thorndyke, "and I think it is. But could you swear to the identity in a court of law?" "It is my firm conviction that the photograph is that of Mr. Graves. I would swear to that." "No man ought to swear to more," said Thorndyke. "Identification is always a matter of opinion or belief. The man who will swear unconditionally to identify from memory only is a man whose evidence should be discredited. I think your sworn testimony would be sufficient." It is needless to say that the production of this photograph filled me with amazement and curiosity as to how Thorndyke had obtained it. But as he replaced it impassively in its envelope without volunteering any explanation, I felt that I could not question him directly. Nevertheless, I ventured to approach the subject in an indirect manner. "Did you get any information from those Darmstadt people?" I asked. "Schnitzler? Yes. I learned, through the medium of an official acquaintance, that Dr. H. Weiss was a stranger to them, that they knew nothing about him excepting that he had ordered from them, and had been supplied with, 100 grams of pure hydrochlorate of morphine." "All at once?" "No, in separate parcels of 25 grams each." Is that all you know about Weiss?" "It is all that I actually know, but it is not all that I suspect, on very substantial grounds. By the way, what did you think of the coachman?" "I don't know that I thought very much about him. Why?" "You never suspected that he and Weiss were one and the same person?" "No, how could they be? They weren't in the least alike, and one was a Scotchman and the other a German. But perhaps you know that they were the same?" "I only know what you have told me. But considering that you never saw them together, that the coachman was never available for messages or assistance when Weiss was with you, that Weiss always made his appearance some time after you arrived, and disappeared some time before you left, it has seemed to me that they might have been the same person." "I should say it was impossible. They were so very different in appearance. But supposing that they were the same, would the fact be of any importance?" "It would mean that we could save ourselves the trouble of looking for the coachman, and it would suggest some inferences which will occur to you if you think the matter over. But being only a speculative opinion at present, it would not be safe to infer very much from it." "You have rather taken me by surprise," I remarked. "It seems that you have been working at this Kennington case, and working pretty actively, I imagine, whereas I supposed that your entire attention was taken up by the Blackmore affair." "It doesn't do," he replied, "to allow one's entire attention to be taken up by any one case. I have half a dozen others, minor cases mostly, to which I am attending at this moment. Did you think I was proposing to keep you under lock and key indefinitely?" "Well, no, but I thought the Kennington case would have to wait its turn, and I had no idea that you were in possession of enough facts to enable you to get any farther with it." "But you knew all the very striking facts of the case, and you saw the further evidence that we extracted from the empty house." "Do you mean those things that we picked out from the rubbish under the grate?" "Yes. You saw those curious little pieces of reed and the pair of spectacles. They are lying in the top drawer of that cabinet at this moment, and I should recommend you to have another look at them. To me, they are most instructive. The pieces of reed offered an extremely valuable suggestion, and the spectacles enabled me to test that suggestion and turn it into actual information." "Unfortunately," said I, "the pieces of reed convey nothing to me. I don't know what they are, or of what they have formed a part." "I think," he replied, "that if you examine them with due consideration, you will find their use pretty obvious. Have a good look at them, and the spectacles too. Think over all that you know of that mysterious group of people who lived in that house, and see if you cannot form some coherent theory of their actions. Think also if we have not some information in our possession by which we might be able to identify some of them and infer the identity of the others. You will have a quiet day, as I shall not be home until the evening. Set yourself this task. I assure you that you have the material for identifying, or rather for testing the identity of, at least one of those persons. Go over your material systematically, and let me know in the evening what further investigations you would propose." "Very well," said I. "It shall be done according to your word. I will addle my brain afresh with the affair of Mr. Weiss and his patient, and let the Blackmore case rip." "There is no need to do that. You have a whole day before you. An hour's really close consideration of the Kennington case ought to show you what your next move should be, and then you could devote yourself to the consideration of Geoffrey Blackmore's will." With this final piece of advice, Thorndyke collected the papers for his day's work, and having deposited them in his brief bag, took his departure, leaving me to my meditations. End of Chapter 12. Recording by Rosie.